Hi, I am back with another video. This is about role of the state in the macroeconomy. Unit 4, chapters 34 to 38. Learning objectives. Understand the difference between capital expenditure, current expenditure and transfer payments. Understand the significance of different levels of public expenditure as a portion of the GDP. Understand the basic reasons for taxation. Understand the economic effects of changes in direct and indirect taxes. Understand the difference between fiscal deficit and fiscal surplus. Understand how governments use fiscal policy and monetary policy to change economic variables. Government expenditure. When it comes to government expenditure, we have four types: capital expenditure, current expenditure, transfer payments and debt interest payments. If you are to talk about capital expenditure, it is any expense incurred on investment goods such as new schools, hospitals. These will be consumed within a period more than 1 year. And when we come to current expenditure, it is any expenditure incurred on the consumption of goods and services in a short period of time. For an example, the wages of the government workers, the electricity bill of schools. The recurring expenditures is what we call as the current expenditure. These are occurring within a period less than 1 year. Transfer payments. These are the welfare payments or the welfare benefits paid to people. They are payments by government which there is no corresponding output. Hence, transfer payments are not included in the measurement of the GDP. Some examples of transfer payments would include state pensions and unemployment benefits. Debt interest payments. These are the interest paid on the national debts of the government. Whatever the loans that the government has taken, interest should be paid on the loan. So those interest payments are what we call as the debt interest payments. Reasons for changes in size and pattern of public expenditure. The size of the government spending is measured as a percentage of an economy's GDP. Usually, social security, education, healthcare will be the main expenses of any government. The size and the pattern of expenditure by a government may change due to the following reasons. Changes in income. Lower the income of the country, lower the spending of the government in that country. This is partly because lower income countries lack a tax base to raise revenue to pay for the government spending. Taxes such as income tax and VAT are difficult to administer, partly because in some countries the population density is very low in some rural regions. It is also easy to avoid in lower income countries because the size of the informal economy is large. Changing age distributions. If majority of the country's population is aging, then the government will have to increase its spending on health care. On the other hand, if majority of the country's population is younger, then the need for education, training would be high. So majority of the government spending would be targeted on the young population. Changing expectations. Higher the incomes of a country, the higher that they demand high quality goods and services. So when the income of the people increases, they demand more goods and services. So if the government has taken up the responsibility of producing certain goods and services. With the increase in income, the demand for such goods and services would also increase. Other factors. This includes resource efficiency, the austerity debate, and disincentive effects of taxation and welfare benefits. Let us now look at the significance of different levels of public expenditure as a proportion of the GDP. Productivity and growth. Free market economists argue that governments can never be efficient as the private sector. They argue that the public sector spending is often wasteful and inefficient because a government lacks the profit motive. In the private sector, the firms will drive down their cost in order to maximize their profit. Otherwise, if they incur unnecessary expenses, their profitability will come down. So when private sector businesses reduce their cost, it is known as productive efficiency. Also, they will produce goods and services which the consumers wish to buy, ensuring that they are allocatively efficient. So, in a market economy, in a private sector, the businesses ensure that they are both productively and allocatively efficient. So, it is believed that if the government changes its spending on more productive areas, they would achieve better productivity in the future without producing all the goods that are necessary. If they move their investments to the most profitable areas, they would be better in productivity. Crowding out. If the economy is at full employment and on its production possibility frontier, it would seem logical to suggest that increasing government spending in the public sector will lead to a decrease in the spending on the private sector. Now this is the full efficiency line. The red line shows the full efficiency in an economy. Point E shows public sector spending is 3000 and the private sector spending is 2000. When it comes to point F, when the point E moves to F, in order to increase public sector spending, we have to forgive private sector spending. So whatever the increase in the public sector spending has happened at the expense of the private sector. So when point E moves along the production possibility frontier to point F, the private sector spending would be sacrificed. This is known as the crowding out effect. Crowding in. As we discussed earlier, this is the original production possibility frontier. Suppose the country is operating at point T. When long-term investments are done, the productive potential of the country would increase, meaning that it would shift to the right side. The PPC would shift to the right side. So crowding in means, assume the economy is at the full employment on its production possibility frontier at point E. Public sector investment increases the productive potential of the economy, shifting the PPC to the right, moving the production to point F. Increased public sector spending has crowded in both private sector and public sector spending. So with the spending done by the public sector, the potential of both the sectors has increased. That is what we call as the crowding in. Here we are not sacrificing, instead both the sectors are experiencing an increase in the potential. Let us now look at the effects of taxation. Reasons for taxation. To pay for the government expenditure. Governments need to raise finance for their expenditure programs. They can borrow a limited amount of money for this, but for most of the finance must come from taxation if inflation is to be avoided. To correct market failures, governments can intervene in individual markets by changing taxes and thus changing demand. For an example, tobacco consumption can be reduced by raising taxes on cigarettes. Pollution can be controlled by imposing pollution taxes. Thereby, another reason for the government to tax people is to correct the market failures. To manage the economy as a whole, taxation can have important influence on the macroeconomic performance of the economy. Governments may change the tax rates in order to influence the variables such as inflation, unemployment, balance of payments, and etc. Direct and indirect taxes. These are the two types of taxes. A direct tax is levied directly on the company or the individual. Examples of direct taxes would include income tax, corporation tax, capital gains tax, and inheritance tax. An indirect tax is a tax on consumption or levied on goods and services. Examples would be VAT, excise duties, and custom duties. Economies will raise revenue from both direct and indirect taxes. Progressive, regressive, and proportional taxes. A progressive tax is where higher portion is charged when the income increases. Example, 5% of tax for an income of 20,000 and 25% tax for an income of 40,000. So when the income is increasing, the percentage of tax that you should pay is also increasing. People earning very low incomes pay no income tax, while others on very high incomes pay a higher rate of tax to the government. Regressive tax. This is where the portion of tax burden falls as the income rises. Example, indirect taxes such as VAT tend to be regressive. As income increases, households tend to spend less as a portion of their income and save more. The result is that taxes on spending fall as a proportion of income. Proportional tax is when the tax percentage stays the same while the income is increasing. Example, 10% tax when the income is 40,000 and 10% tax when the income is 60,000. The percentage of tax is the same, but the burden of tax, the value of the tax that should be paid, is increasing. Economic effects of changes in direct and indirect taxes. Incentive to work. High marginal rates of tax discourage economic activities. For an example, a tax on cigarette leads to fewer cigarettes being bought. A tax on work, income tax, leads to people working less. A tax on profit discourages firms from making profit and being innovative. Lowering certain taxes will therefore raise the level of economic activity and increase the aggregate supply. Free market economies believe that the supply of labor is relatively elastic. A reduction in marginal tax rates on income will lead to significant increase in work. Income distribution. Changes in direct and indirect taxes are likely to have an effect on income distribution. Direct taxes on income tend to be progressive. Those on very low incomes pay no income tax, while those on high incomes pay a higher rate of tax than those who are on low incomes. Indirect taxes such as VAT tend to be regressive. As income increases, households tend to spend less as a proportion of their income and save more. The result is that taxes on spending falls as a proportion of the income when the income is rising. The impact of a change in tax revenue for the government on income distribution after tax will depend on why tax revenues have been charged. The trade balance. An increase in taxes on households will reduce their disposable income. Thus, in turn, will reduce their consumption, including spending on imports. Hence, the trade balance will improve as the imports are being demanded less. Equally, a cut in consumption will reduce aggregate demand. With the aggregate demand falling from what it would otherwise have been, firms will need less capacity to meet the demand, so they will need to invest less. Real output, price levels and employment. Aggregate demand, such as income tax and employees' national insurance contribution, affects aggregate demand. A rise in income tax rates reduces the disposable income of households. Therefore, they will spend less. This leads to a fall in consumption and the fall in the output demanded at any given price. Also, when the tax rates are higher, people will have less disposable income, meaning they will demand less. This will lead to a reduction in the quantity of demand and also the price levels. When people are being taxed on what they earn, they are having a less incentive to work and get the unemployment benefits from the government. So this affects the real output, price levels and employment as well. FDI flows. Foreign direct investments is normally defined as an investment by a foreign company where foreign company acquires 10% shares or more of shares of a domestic company. So when the tax rate is higher, FDIs are reluctantly coming into the country as they are being taxed on their profit more than other countries. So with the changes, with the increases in taxes, the FDI flows will reduce. Public sector borrowing and public sector debt. Fiscal deficit and fiscal surplus. A fiscal deficit or a budget deficit is when the government spending is more than the income that they receive. A surplus is when the income of the government is higher than the spending in the country. So there is excess income when paid for all the expenses of the government. Fiscal deficit and national debt. National debt is the total borrowing of a government. The size of the fiscal deficit or the surplus will have a direct impact on the total national debt of the government. That means, suppose the fiscal deficit of a country is 10 million, then the national debts of the country will rise by 10 million. Suppose the fiscal surplus of a country is 5 million, then the national debts of the country will reduce by 5 million. So based on the value of the fiscal deficit or the surplus, the level of national debt will also vary. Fiscal balance and the national debt can be measured in two ways. One is as a value. For an example, 10 million, 20 million. Likewise, we are measuring it in terms of a value, or else as a percentage of the GDP. We could say the national debt of the country is 10% of the GDP. Automatic stabilizer and discretionary fiscal policy. An automatic stabilizer is a mechanism by which affects the level of government spending and taxation without any direct intervention by the government. When national income changes, this occurs automatically and act to minimize fluctuations in the actual GDP. It results from a set of rules largely on welfare payments, income tax and goods and services tax, which influence how much government spends and raises in taxation without any intervention by government policymakers. Automatic changes in fiscal policy instruments help to reduce variations in the economic cycle. Government spending and taxation are both automatic stabilizers. This means changes in government spending and tax revenue occur automatically as GDP changes. Discretionary fiscal policy is when the government deliberately makes changes to the tax rates, introduce new taxes, or change the government spending. So what we should notice here is that in automatic stabilizer there is no government intervention. It is led to the market forces to decide and correct the prevailing situation. A discretionary fiscal policy is when the government deliberately makes changes. So automatic stabilizer, it happens automatically, whereas in discretionary fiscal policy the government does some changes in order to correct the fiscal deficit. Current budget deficits, primary budget deficits and actual budget deficits. Let us now look at what these terms actually mean. A current budget deficit is when the government revenue is less than the current expenditure. That means whatever the income that comes to the country is not even enough to pay for the current expenditures of that government. Primary deficit is the actual deficit of the government without considering the interest on any money borrowed by the government. Actual deficit is the addition of primary deficit plus the interest on national debts. Factors influencing the size of fiscal deficit and surplus. State of the economy. Cyclical deficits and surpluses are caused by the effects of automatic stabilizers on the level of government spending and tax revenue. They are out of the government's control in short run. For example, a downturn in an economy is likely to automatically increase the government spending on welfare payments and at the same time reduce tax revenue as tax receipts from direct and indirect taxation falls. However, the size of cyclical effect will vary from country to country depending on the welfare and tax system. Demographic changes. The size and the age composition of the population may affect the size of the fiscal deficit. For example, if an economy has an aging population, the government is likely to be under pressure to increase spending on healthcare to maintain the quality of life for this aging group and also to reduce the number of deaths from sicknesses. With increased medical advances and rising expectations of treatments available, government spending overall on healthcare will increase. Taxation. The size of the tax base might increase if new taxes are introduced. This will reduce the fiscal deficit as it increases the government revenue. Economic development. In developing countries, government spending may be linked to economic development. When the economy is doing well, there is a temptation on the part of the government decision makers to assume that it will continue to do well in the future. Borrowing a little more to finance a favorite spending project or a tax cut for poor voters can become too attractive to resist. Debt interest. Debt interest is a part of the fiscal deficit or surplus. The larger the debt interest paid, the larger the deficit or smaller the surplus, as majority of the income of the government should be paid as the interest for any money borrowed. Unforeseen events. Occasionally, governments may have to respond to major unforeseen events which cannot be covered with monies set aside for these situations. That could be coronavirus could be one good example of an unforeseen event. It was never expected that Sri Lanka and all the countries in the world would be so badly affected from this pandemic. Significance of fiscal deficits and national debts. Impact on interest rates. All other things being equal, a rise in government borrowing in a national economy should lead to a rise in the market interest rates in that country. This is because the demand for borrowed money increases relative to the supply. Debt servicing. This refers to the regular repayment which would be done to the lenders of the outstanding borrowings. It has been explained in the previous slides that a rise in government borrowing is likely to lead to a rise in the amount of interest that is being paid to the borrowers. Intergenerational equity. This refers to the fairness between different generations. Economists argue that increasing fiscal deficits are of benefit to the current generation but at the cost of future generations. This is because the prevailing budget deficit might be because due to the excessive government spending and excessive consumption. That is good for the current generation, but for the future generations it is a huge loan burden that comes to their head. Macroeconomic policies. We have 5 main macroeconomic policies, namely fiscal policy, monetary policy, exchange rate policy, direct controls, and supply side policies. Fiscal policy. This uses taxation and government spending to achieve policy objectives. So we can say fiscal instruments are taxation and government spending. Monetary policy. The main monetary policy instruments are money supply and interest rates. So it is using the money supply and the interest rates where the objectives are being achieved through monetary policy. Exchange rate policy. This uses exchange rate manipulations in order to achieve objectives. Direct controls. These are the measures used by the government imposed on price or quantity of a product. Example, maximum price, minimum wage rate, etc. Supply side policies. These are the instruments used to increase the productive potential of the country. For an example, education and training. Policies to reduce fiscal deficits and national debts. One method is through the fiscal austerity. That is when the government reduces spending and increases taxes. More often, both are done together. That means the government will reduce their spending while increasing the rate of taxes. But there are some problems related to fiscal austerity. One problem is it reduces the welfare of citizens now and in future. Another problem is it will lead to a fall in the GDP because reduction in the government spending reduces the aggregate demand, which leads to a fall in the GDP. Reducing government spending and increasing taxes reduces aggregate demand. As explained above, when the government spending is reduced and the taxes are increased, the aggregate demand of the country reduces. So one method to correct the fiscal deficit is through the fiscal austerity, where the government will control their spending and try to ensure higher tax revenues. Another method is the automatic stabilizing, which involves waiting till things correct on their own. As I have explained automatic stabilization in the previous slides, I won't be going into the depth of it. Policies to respond to external shocks in the global economy. Commodity price shocks. This is when the price of a main product fluctuates very often. So reflationary policy should be used in order to increase the aggregate demand. Example, fluctuations in oil prices in the global market. Demand side shocks. This is when an economy experiences a fall in demand for exports as a result of fall in aggregate demand in trading countries. For an example, if Sri Lanka is exporting tea to India, a reduction in the income or the aggregate demand in India would mean that the exports we are sending to India are being less demanded. So that is what we call as demand side shocks. Impacts and problems of macroeconomic policies. Measures to control transnational companies. Reduce tax avoidance, regulations of transfer pricing. In 2015, all the OECD and G20 countries agreed to adopt new rules which help them to minimize the tax avoidance done by transnational companies. And also these countries formed new rules on transfer pricing which controlled and coordinated the actions of transnational companies. The number of frauds that they can do was minimized due to proper formation of rules and regulations. Impact of policy changes in different economies. Impact of changes on local economies. Sometimes a policy change will affect particular cities, districts or part of an economy than the others. For example, the government's decision to construct the Mattala airport benefited majority of the citizens living in the Mattala area rather than people living in some other districts of the country. Impact of policy changes on national economies. Governments usually make policy changes to influence the economy as a whole. For example, a fall in income tax rates should have a positive multiplier effect throughout the economy. A government will make policy changes to try to achieve its macroeconomic objectives. So, it will have an effect on the overall national economy. Impact of policy changes on global economy. Any policy changes made by the large world economies such as China, United States are likely to have an impact on the global economy. China's economy is moving from growth based on exports towards consumption-led growth. This policy change is likely to affect many other countries. Rising consumption in China will mean total export-led growth for many other countries in the world. Policies which increase economic growth in China also tend to have a direct impact on commodity prices. This in turn benefits commodity exporters throughout the world. Problems faced by policymakers. Let us now look at what are the problems that the policymakers face when developing government policies. Inaccurate information. Due to many reasons, the information held by policymakers would be outdated or inaccurate. This is because some of the information is very difficult to collect. For example, first estimates of GDP figures for the previous month can be inaccurate by several percent because it is not possible to collect accurate data within such a short period of time. As more data comes in, GDP figures are revised and more accurate pictures emerges. Risk and uncertainty. The future is always uncertain to some degree. Some uncertainties are fairly easy to predict. For example, clothes sellers will never know for certain how extreme their seasonal temperatures will be, particularly in countries where weather is very different year to year. This directly affects the type of clothes sold and when to be sold. Making the wrong decision about orders could leave the retailers with so many unsold clothing. External shocks. These are the factors which cannot be controlled by a government. For example, the world price of oil increased from $2 a barrel to $11 a barrel. This created large inflationary pressures in oil importing countries. We have come to the end of our video. Hope everything is clear. Thank you.